In today's documentary on dark bonds, we will dive into a crime that will make you speechless. This crime happened in 1999 and ended, or almost ended, in 2024. This documentary may be a little bit long, but I promise that you will be surprised every single minute. Finally, if you made it till the end of this video and made your own assumption, you can share the video because maybe, just maybe, you can save an innocent man from the comfort of your bedroom. As always, please note that the details of this documentary may include some content that some may find sensitive. Viewer discretion is advised. Now, let's start our true crime documentary. At around 7 o'clock on the morning of June 16, 1998, Barton McNeil, a 39-year-old divorced father, woke up in Bloomington, Illinois. The night before had been a disaster. Barton had just ended things with his girlfriend, Misook Nowlin. They'd gone out to dinner at a local Italian place of Aunties. It should have been a simple meal, but it turned into yet another argument. Misook was furious, jealous even. She admitted to digging through Barton's trash and his phone records, convinced he was cheating. This wasn't the first time Misook had lost control. Just the year before, she'd been convicted of domestic assault against Barton. The next morning, this very morning, Barton was supposed to testify against her during her sentencing hearing. Misook didn't want him to do it. She begged him to speak for her instead. For a moment, he actually considered it. Barton wasn't a cruel man. He pitied her. But dinner changed that. The jealousy in Misook's voice, her trembling anger as they paid the bill, it unsettled him. As he left the restaurant furious, she followed him into the parking lot. He stopped briefly when she warned him about smoke coming from his car's exhaust. But Barton didn't care. That night was meant for his 3-year-old daughter, Christina. He still had to pick her up from his ex-wife's house. The next morning, Barton stood in the bathroom, staring at his reflection, replaying the events of the night before. Misook's trembling hands, her pleading eyes, the anger etched into her face. He pushed it out of his mind and called out to Christina from the bathroom. It was time to wake up and get ready for daycare. Yet there was no response. Barton assumed she was still asleep. He called her name again, but nothing. Time was running out. Barton worked as a prep cook at the nearby Red Lobster. He had less than an hour to get Christina to daycare and make it to work. He showered quickly. Then finally, he went to check on her. What he saw in that bedroom stopped him cold. Christina lay motionless, wrapped tightly in her floral bedsheet. Her eyes were wide open, her small face pale as stone. Barton froze. A wave of terror clenched his stomach. He could feel the air being ripped from his lungs. Barton stumbled to the phone, his hands shaking. He dialed 911. He told them he needed an ambulance to 1106 North Evans, and he believed that his daughter is dying. Frantic Barton tried CPR. He pressed his lips to Christina's, but a guttural noise escaped her mouth like a low moan. Blood trickled from her nose. Her tiny body went limp in his arms. The paramedics arrived within minutes, but it was too late. Barton collapsed onto the kitchen floor as the EMTs worked on Christina. Their voices shouted instructions over the sounds of equipment slamming open and boots pounding against the floor. Police officers entered next, heavy-footed their presence adding to the chaos. Yet somehow, Barton could still see her, little Christina, still wearing his oversized Red Lobster shirt and her white underwear that read, Monday in tiny letters. His screams echoed through the house, hysterical. Yet something about him struck the paramedics as odd. He wasn't crying. When officers asked for his ex-wife, Tita McNeil's phone number, Barton froze. He looked lost. It was as if he couldn't remember, even though he'd called that number almost daily. When Tita McNeil finally arrived at the house, her voice rang out like a dagger. "What did you do to my baby?" Her words hit Barton like a slap. Tita collapsed next to Christina's small body. She began stroking her daughter's pale arm, whispering softly, as though her touch could wake her up. Barton sat nearby, silent, staring blankly into space. At 9:19 a.m., on June 16, 1998, the coroner's team removed Christina's small body from the apartment. Less than 15 minutes later, believing there was nothing suspicious about her death, the police released the scene. The apartment fell silent. The friends who had carried Tita away were gone. The authorities had left. Barton McNeil sat alone on his balcony, chain-smoking cigarettes. But then something unexpected happened. Misook Nowlin returned. Earlier that morning, while police were still there, Barton had told her to leave. Now, she was back. Misook parked her car a few houses away and approached quietly. Her demeanor was cold, distant, completely out of character. And then she said something Barton would never forget. Could Christina have been killed? Her words sliced through him. Barton's mind spun. Killed? What did she mean? They spoke briefly. Barton later insisted the conversation happened outside, while Misook claimed it took place inside the apartment. Either way, after a few chilling words, Misook left for work, as though nothing had happened. Barton was rattled. Her question haunted him. Could Christina have been killed? What was Misook implying? Was she involved? Unable to think straight, Barton left the empty apartment and drove to his ex-wife Tita's house. She was the only person who could possibly share his pain. But even there, he found no comfort. As he sat with Tita, his mind raced. Questions repeated endlessly in his head, but one stood out like a sharp blade. Why had Misook called him the night before? She'd asked if he was home with Christina. She'd asked where Christina was sleeping. Later, phone records would confirm this call, but Misook would claim she didn't remember it. Why had she returned that morning and stayed until police were gone? Could Misook have killed Christina? Barton's mind refused to rest. It didn't make sense. The front door was locked. Barton had been sleeping on the couch right next to it. He'd even secured the screen door the night before, a precaution, knowing Misook's temper. If someone had entered, they had to have come through Christina's window. Barton thought back to that morning. There had been something odd about the room. Then it hit him. The fan. It was on the floor. It wasn't in the window where it had been all spring. If someone came through the window, they would have had to move the fan and tamper with the screen. Barton left Tita's house and rushed back to his apartment. He went straight to Christina's room. That's when he saw it. There were small holes in the bottom corners of the window screen. The mesh was out of place, completely off its track. At 5:16 p.m., 10 hours after finding Christina's lifeless body, Barton called 911 again. His voice was calm, but urgent. My name is Barton McNeil. I found my daughter dead this morning at this address. The investigators were here, the coroner, but I need a detective, a homicide detective. I have reason to believe she was murdered. In the late 1990s, Bloomington Normal was the picture of small-town perfection. Victorian houses lined the quiet streets. Some roads were still cobblestone. Crime, especially murder, was so rare that the Bloomington police didn't even have a dedicated homicide unit. When Barton made that second 911 call, the officers didn't believe him. The dispatcher even sounded annoyed. What's his problem? One officer reportedly asked. It took 45 minutes for a detective to arrive. Barton met him on the sidewalk and pointed to Christina's window. He was adamant. Misook did this. She killed my daughter, he said. The detective stayed to examine the screen. Barton was sent to the police station for questioning. A crime scene expert who had been there earlier was also called back. He confirmed that he'd seen a small hole in the screen that morning, but there was something else. Spiderwebs. The expert said there were strands of spiderweb connecting the screen to the window frame. At the station, Barton recounted his story. He picked up Christina around 7 p.m. the night before. She hadn't eaten, so he took her to McDonald's for a happy meal. By 10:30, Barton started Christina's bedtime routine. 15 minutes later, she was asleep. He then sat at his computer and spent hours chatting online with a woman in the Philippines. At midnight, Barton said he heard a noise from Christina's room. He checked and found her sitting up in bed, smiling. He tucked her back in. By 2 a.m., Barton lay down on the couch, glancing one last time into Christina's room. At the station, Barton wasn't interested in explaining his routine. His focus was Misook. She's obsessed. She's violent. She's crazy, Barton insisted. Killing Christina was her revenge. But the police didn't seem convinced. When Barton left the station that night, his theory felt ignored. The next day, Barton returned to the police station. Frustrated and exhausted, he lashed out. My only daughter is lying on a cold slab of concrete, and you're sitting on your asses. I want the forensics team at my house now. Meanwhile, investigators questioned Misook Nowlin. She told them that after the argument at Avanti's, she'd gone home and spent time with friends. Around 8 p.m., They went to a local pool hall. Misook returned home at 9:30 with her friend Susie Kaiser. The two stayed up eating Korean food and talking for hours. Susie confirmed this. Misook had told her that night she wanted to visit Barton, but Susie had convinced her not to. Phone records later showed Misook received a call at 12:21 a.m. She hoped it was Barton. She was desperate to talk to him. But it wasn't him. It was her brother in Korea. The call lasted 62 seconds. Misook claimed she went to bed immediately after. The next morning, she was woken up at 6 a.m. by her ex-husband, Andy Nowlin, who'd come to pick up clothes for their daughter. In another room at the police station, Barton McNeil wasn't doing himself any favors. He kept calling himself a suspect, almost daring the police to arrest him. "Go ahead and arrest me," he told them, instead of arresting no one at all. Then he said something chilling. "I don't know what the autopsy results are yet, but I already know what they'll say. Death by suffocation." The investigators fell silent. Barton's words unsettled them. They had been waiting anxiously for the coroner's report. Hours later, Dr. Violet Henlecka released the results of Christina's autopsy. The cause of death was suffocation. But there was something else. Dr. Henlecka noticed swelling in Christina's genital area, raising concerns about a possible sexual assault. That same day, police brought Barton in for another interrogation. This time, it lasted nearly 8 hours. There are no recordings or transcripts of that interview, only police summaries. According to their notes, Barton's claims made no sense. There were spiderwebs on Christina's window frame. A thunderstorm had rolled through the night before. If an intruder had come through the window, wouldn't there be muddy footprints? Yet the carpet inside the apartment was completely dry. To the investigators, it all pointed to one conclusion. Barton McNeil and Christina had been alone inside a locked apartment. There were no signs of anyone else. Barton must have killed Christina. The motive? Sexual assault. Perhaps Barton was abusing his daughter, and things got out of control. Maybe he smothered her to cover it up. But Barton didn't waver. "I didn't touch my daughter," he insisted. "Misook killed her." After hours of questioning, one of the detectives asked if Barton was hungry. He said yes. When they returned, they handed him a small brown bag from McDonald's. Inside was a kid's meal, a burger, fries, and a beanie baby lobster. The same meal Christina had eaten the night before, the same toy she'd played with. It felt like a gut punch. Then the police told Barton they were interrogating Misook at that very moment. Desperate, Barton begged them to let him confront her directly. To his surprise, they agreed. The two were brought into the same room. It was a mistake. The conversation quickly exploded into a heated argument. Barton accused Misook of killing Christina. Misook denied everything, screaming back at him. The police intervened, separating them. Misook was released, but was told she would undergo a polygraph test. Moments later, as she sat in the police station parking lot, Misook Nowlin passed out. Barton, on the other hand, spent the night in the county jail. He was placed on suicide watch. By morning, he was formally charged with murdering his daughter, Christina. For weeks after his arrest, Barton convinced himself that the police would realize their mistake. But everything changed when he was officially indicted. His family turned on him. They begged him to stop accusing Misook, but Barton refused. He started writing letters, to friends, to journalists, even to Detective Larry Shepard, the lead investigator. He pleaded with Shepard to investigate Misook. In one letter, dated mid-July 1998, Barton wrote, "I've always been confident that some of you believe me. I know the investigation is still ongoing and that Misook is still a suspect. For that, I'm very grateful." Barton was right. The police were aware of Misook Nowlin's violent past. She had a previous conviction for domestic assault against Barton. Police searched her home and seized 2 vibrators, items Barton claimed Misook may have used to sexually assault Christina. However, forensic testing found no trace of Christina's DNA on them. When Misook underwent a polygraph test, she denied entering Barton's apartment that night. She denied killing Christina. The polygraph examiner noted her poor English and inconsistent responses. It made it impossible to draw a clear conclusion about her answers. Then, in mid-September 1998, something startling happened. Detective Larry Shepard, the same investigator on Christina's case, opened an unrelated investigation into Misook Nowlin. Misook's 9-year-old daughter, Michelle Nowlin, had told her school principal, Aisha Frazier, that her mother was abusing her. Frazier contacted Child Protective Services. During testimony in that case, Frazier described seeing a 3-inch-long bruise on Michelle's thigh. It was obvious it had been there for a while, she said. Michelle told Frazier that Misook had threatened to kill her. She held my nose and covered my mouth, Michelle said. She told me, "I'll kill you tonight." Barton McNeil was determined to bring all of this up at his trial as part of his defense, but in December 1998, the prosecution filed a motion to exclude any evidence or arguments suggesting Misook's involvement in Christina's death. In their motion, the prosecution wrote, "In this case, the defendant's allegations against Misook are entirely speculative and unsupported by evidence." At a pre-trial hearing in March 1999, known as an offer of proof, Barton's attorney fought to have the evidence against Misook included. Among the witnesses they called was a DCFS investigator. The investigator testified that Michelle Nowlin, just 9 years old, told him her mother had hit her and threatened, "I'll kill you tonight." But would any of this matter? Or had the court already made up its mind? Barton's fight for justice was just beginning. In a final effort to strengthen Barton McNeil's defense, his team called Andy Nowlin, Misook's ex-husband, to testify. Andy dropped a bombshell in court. The night before Christina's death, Andy said he received a call from Misook. She had an odd request. She wanted him to help her set Barton up by planting marijuana in his car. Andy didn't know why Misook wanted to cause trouble for Barton. He assumed it was her jealousy, but he didn't know the real reason. Misook, when questioned, claimed she couldn't remember calling Andy at all, but phone records told a different story. She'd called him 3 times that night, the last call at 10:52 p.m. Misook denied going to Barton's apartment that night and denied asking Andy to bring her marijuana. Then, bizarrely, she admitted that she might have asked him for it, as a joke. She also told investigators why she returned to Barton's apartment the morning of Christina's death. "I needed help with my computer," she said. Then, after a pause, she added softly, "And I kind of missed him." In a devastating blow to Barton's defense, the court ruled to exclude any evidence suggesting Misook's involvement. The trial was set for June 1999. Fearing that a jury would be too emotional to hear his case fairly, Barton opted for a bench trial, a trial decided solely by the judge. After the judge's decision, Barton wrote to Tita, Christina's mother, begging for her support, but she never responded. The prosecution called 15 witnesses to the stand. Barton's defense called 3, including Barton himself. The state's case was clear and methodical. They pointed out the obvious. Barton was alone with Christina in a locked apartment the night she died. There were no signs of an intruder. They dismissed the hole in Christina's window screen, claiming it had likely been there for some time. A crime scene investigator disagreed. He testified that there was more than one hole in the screen, and it looked slightly out of place, even falling when the police tried to move it. But the most damaging testimony came from Dr. Henleka, the coroner. She confirmed swelling in Christina's genital area, saying it was consistent with sexual assault. She also estimated Christina's time of death at 10:30 p.m. based on the contents of her stomach, a method that was notoriously unreliable, even in the late 1990s. Still, it was enough to cast doubt on Barton's story that he'd seen Christina awake and smiling at midnight, and it gave Misook Nowlin an alibi. When Barton took the stand, he was frustrated, emotional, and angry. "The police ignored everything I told them," he said. "From the very first day, everything they've done has been complete garbage." He wanted to point the finger at Misook, but the judge had already ruled he couldn't. The court's conclusion was damning. "There's no evidence that anyone else entered the apartment," the judge said. Referring to Christina's estimated time of death, he added, "This certainly did not happen during the time Barton McNeil says he last saw his daughter alive." The judge couldn't ignore Barton's closeness to his daughter that night, nor the prosecution's theory of motive, that Barton had sexually assaulted her and smothered her to hide it. He also highlighted Barton's strange behavior during police interviews. This was a man who clearly understood a murder had occurred, knew he was a suspect, and had already prepared his defense. Barton McNeil was found guilty of murdering his 3-year-old daughter, Christina. The sentence: life in prison. After his conviction, the state's judgment became gospel. To Tita, Barton was a monster who had sexually abused and killed their daughter. She never answered any of his letters. Barton's family fell apart. They begged him to stop accusing Misook. When he refused, they abandoned him. Barton never heard from his father again. When his father passed away in 2017, Barton learned about it from the prison staff. Between 2002 and 2011, Barton's case faded into obscurity. His appeals were rejected. No innocence organization would take on his case. For nearly a decade, Barton's only support came from his cousin, Grace Schlafly. She fought tirelessly, filing Freedom of Information requests, contacting forensic experts, and searching for witnesses. But life got in the way. Grace became a full-time caregiver for her father, and her support gradually diminished. Barton grew more isolated. Desperate for connection, he began sending letters to strangers, pulling addresses from pen pal websites. But the letters always came back unopened. It was like I'd been forgotten by the world, Barton later said. All that time, guilt gnawed at him. Barton may not have killed Christina, but he felt responsible. He'd let Misook into his life, into his daughter's life, the woman he once loved, because she reminded him of a Hollywood starlet from a bygone era, had destroyed everything. But who was Misook Nowlin, who Barton claimed she is the pure evil? Misook Nowlin was born in the suburbs of Seoul to a middle-class family. Her mother died when she was young, and she suffered physical abuse as a child. At 19, she became pregnant by an older man. Overwhelmed and unprepared, she gave the child up for adoption, barely aware of what was happening. Her life took a turn when she met Andy Nowlin, an American serviceman. Their whirlwind romance led to marriage and a move to Illinois. The couple had a daughter, Michelle, but life in the United States wasn't easy. Misook struggled to fit in. She spent impulsively and shoplifted out of desperation, leading to 2 convictions, first in 1991 and again in 1996. While Misook admitted she had a temper, others said she was simply violent. She blamed her upbringing. "That's just how my father raised me," she explained. Misook Nowlin's past painted a troubling picture, but was that enough to connect her to Christina's death? Or had Barton McNeil been condemned for a crime he didn't commit? The answers were far from clear. In September 2011, 70-year-old Linda Tida, a Chinese translator, disappeared after leaving her home for work in Bloomington. A week later, an unexpected witness stepped forward. A waitress, who also spoke Chinese, told police that Misook Nowlin had paid her $20 to pose as a client and arrange a meeting with Linda Tida. The waitress set the trap. Linda agreed to meet this supposed client in the parking lot of a grocery store, but the truth was captured on surveillance cameras. Misook Nowlin, not the waitress, met Linda in the parking lot. The footage showed them in a heated argument. Misook grabbed Linda's arm and yanked at her purse. After the confrontation, both women drove away. Linda's car followed Misook's to her Bloomington sewing shop. She was never seen again. Authorities zeroed in on Misook. Inside her shop, they found evidence that turned the investigation into a murder case. Linda's shredded ID card, her credit cards, the clothes she was last seen wearing. All of it was stuffed into a trash bin behind the shop. Confronted with the evidence, Misook confessed to killing Linda Tida. The news of Misook's arrest sent shockwaves through Bloomington. One person in particular couldn't believe what he was hearing. Barton McNeil. From inside prison, Barton's friend sent him a newspaper clipping and Misook's mugshot. Barton read the story and froze. The similarities were impossible to ignore. Both Linda Tida and Christina McNeil had died by suffocation. The method, the premeditation, the manipulation, it was all there. This time, Barton thought, people will have to listen to me. From inside his prison cell, Barton scrambled to reach someone, anyone, who would hear his story. Weeks later, he succeeded. A local radio station answered his call. Out of breath, knowing his time was limited, Barton pleaded into the receiver. The planning that Misook allegedly used to kill Mrs. Tida was the same level of planning she used to kill my daughter. The line went silent, but the message was out. One person was listening. Chris Ross, Barton's cousin, didn't know him well. They'd crossed paths a few times at family gatherings, but that was it. Chris had heard the story of Christina's death before. Everyone in the family knew the tragedy, but he never gave it much thought, until that night. Hearing Barton on the radio changed everything. In December 2011, Chris Ross wrote his first letter to Barton. "After hearing your interview, I'm your #1 fan. Seriously, you've been wronged, and I'll do everything I can to get you out, legally." Chris wasn't exaggerating. He started calling Barton every single day. After tucking his kids into bed, Chris stayed awake until 2 or 3 a.m., pouring through thousands of pages of case evidence. He was looking for something, anything, that could help his cousin. The attorneys he consulted all gave him the same advice: hire a private investigator. Specifically, they suggested Kevin McLean. Kevin McLean was a seasoned investigator with nearly 20 years of experience handling high-profile cases. When Chris shared Barton's story, McLean was stunned. "I was fascinated," McLean said later. "I'd never seen a case like this before. The man who begged police to investigate a murder is the same man they charged with committing it." Then came the breakthrough. On what would have been Christina's 17th birthday, Chris received the call he'd been waiting for. The Illinois Innocence Project had agreed to take Barton's case. John Hanlon, former head of the organization and one of Barton's current lawyers, summed it up plainly. There was never any evidence against Barton to begin with. But could the Innocence Project undo a conviction that had held for more than a decade? And would Barton McNeil finally get the justice he'd been fighting for all these years? The truth about Misook Nowlin was finally coming to light. But for Barton, time was running out. In 2012, a shocking revelation emerged. A former neighbor of Misook Nowlin reported something disturbing. She had seen Misook fiddling with a shared storage closet in her apartment complex at 4 a.m. on the night Christina died, the exact time Misook told police in the court she had been asleep. It was the first of many cracks to form in the narrative. Investigators hired by Barton's team dug deeper. They secured 2 sworn statements, one from Michelle Nowlin, Misook's daughter, and another from Dawn Nowlin, Michelle's stepmother. Both statements revealed the same chilling claim. Dawn Wang, Misook's ex-husband, had told them Misook had confessed to killing Christina McNeil. By 2013, Misook Nowlin had been convicted of killing Linda Tida. The method? Strangulation. The Illinois Innocence Project seized on the similarities. In November 2013, they filed a motion for additional DNA testing on the evidence from Christina's 1998 case. They argued the original testing had been limited by technology at the time. When the results came back, it was a bombshell. Misook Nowlin's DNA was found in 6 locations on Christina's floral bedsheets. As Barton's case gained momentum, his team welcomed new reinforcements in 2018. Lawyers from the Exoneration Project, another nonprofit specializing in overturning wrongful convictions, joined the fight. Attorney Carl Leonard was blunt. "There was so much junk science in Barton's case. This was a case we knew we could win." A new forensic review was commissioned. Dr. Andrew Baker, a renowned medical examiner, pored over the 1998 autopsy report, photographs, and biopsy slides. His conclusion? There was no medical evidence of suffocation or homicide. More troublingly, Dr. Baker noted that significant portions of Christina's examination had occurred after the funeral director had prepared her body. This violated standard forensic procedures. His verdict was stunning. Christina's death was unexplained. Another defense expert, Dr. Nancy Harper, director of the Center for Safe and Healthy Children at the University of Minnesota, also reviewed the evidence. Dr. Harper flatly disagreed with the original coroner's conclusion of sexual assault. In her report, she stated that Christina's genital and anal areas appeared normal, with no signs of injury or trauma. Her conclusion? Christina had not been sexually assaulted. For Barton, though, these findings were bittersweet. The possibility of natural causes cleared Misook completely. To Barton, there was no version of events where Misook wasn't responsible for his daughter's death. In 2021, Barton's legal team filed a post-conviction appeal. They presented all the new evidence: Misook's DNA on Christina's bedsheets, the confession claims, and the updated forensic findings. If they succeeded, the court would grant Barton a new trial. But the state of Illinois fought back. They downplayed the DNA evidence, arguing that Misook's close relationship with Barton explained its presence on the sheets. When Barton presented a laundromat receipt as proof he'd washed the sheets the day before Christina's death, the prosecution dismissed it. The receipt wasn't detailed enough to confirm the sheets had been washed. The state also challenged the forensic experts, saying their updated conclusions relied on research published before Christina's death, meaning it couldn't be considered new evidence. In 2022, after weighing the evidence, the judge sided with the state. He ruled that much of the defense's new findings, the DNA, Misook's conviction for killing Linda Tida, the neighbor's testimony about the storage closet, and the updated autopsy reports, were inadmissible. Finally, a hearing was scheduled for November 2023, just days before Thanksgiving. The only evidence the court would consider: the sworn testimonies about Misook's alleged confession. On November 21st, about 20 supporters of Barton McNeil gathered in the McLean County Courthouse lobby. Chris Ross buzzed through the crowd, handing out buttons with Barton's name on them and organizing photos. Friends from Barton's childhood stood alongside journalists and supporters of other wrongful conviction cases. As the clock struck 9 a.m., the group moved to courtroom 5A. Misook Nowlin was the first witness to take the stand. She testified, "My stepdad just blurted it out. He told me, 'Do you know what your mom once said to me?' I just sat there and said, 'No, what?' And he said, 'She told me she killed Christina.'" Next, Dawn Nowlin, Michelle's stepmother, testified. She backed up Michelle's story. He said they'd had a huge fight. During that fight, Misook admitted she killed Christina. Then, the defense called Misook Nowlin to the stand. Carl Leonard, one of Barton's attorneys, asked directly, "Did you kill Christina McNeil?" Misook invoked the Fifth Amendment. Leonard pushed on, referencing her 1998 police interview, where she said she still loved Barton. Again, she invoked the Fifth. Leonard continued, "You told Detective Weckhoff that, days before Christina's death, you went to Barton's apartment and found condoms in the bathroom. That made you suspect he was seeing someone else, correct?" Misook stiffened. Leonard pressed further. "You searched his trash and found printed emails with an online girlfriend. Isn't that true?" Suddenly, Misook snapped. "I didn't kill Christina McNeil," she shouted. Leonard paused, startled. "Are you still invoking the Fifth Amendment?" "Yes," she muttered. Misook refused to answer any more questions. The hearing ended quietly. The prosecution called a former detective to challenge the confessions. Both sides delivered their closing arguments. The judge announced he would issue his ruling in writing. In February 2024, the ruling came down. Barton McNeil would not get a new trial. Barton vowed to appeal the decision to a higher court. But appeals take time, if they're heard at all. And so, we're left with questions. Was Barton McNeil the grieving father he claims to be, wrongly accused of a crime he didn't commit, and Christina's death was for unknown reasons? Or were Barton and his daughter simply victims of Misook Nowlin's calculated rage? Let us know what you think in the comments. Do you believe Barton McNeil is guilty, or do you think justice failed him? Thank you for watching. If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to like and subscribe for more true crime documentaries. See you in the next video.